Show and from the beginning. And welcome to Book of Revelation, chapter 14, part 1. We will be going through the Lamb on Mount Zion versus the Lamb on Mount of Olives, because there is a prophecy about the Messiah standing on the Mount of Olives. Then we'll be also going through the 144,000 and talking about Babylon judged. So let's recap. Revelation chapters 12 to 14 are actually a review of what occurs from the beginning of the birth pains right through until the final victorious battle. Okay, so in Revelation chapter 12, verse 1, you got there the beginning of the labor pains, the beginning of the awakening. In Revelation chapter 14, verse 20, is the final victory over his enemies. It's the summary. Chapter 12 through 14 is the full summary. As I mentioned when we first started to do Revelation chapter 12, the fact that it was the beginning of the summary. Now, yes, it's a weird place to put a summary, right? In the middle, kind of in the middle. But it has to do with the power of thirds. Chapters 1 to 7 are a build up to complete satanic control. Chapters 18 to 14 are the wrath and why there's wrath. Okay, that's in the summary from chapter 12 to 14. Now, chapters 15 to 22 are the final victorious outpouring and the celebration of that victory, okay? Because rabbinical scholars have noticed that there are a lot of thirds, specifically pi, in the Bible, pi being 3.14, but they can see that there's a lot of thirds in the Bible. Example, human history is in approximately thirds through Scripture. We have 1/3 without the law, approximately 2,000 years. There's 1/3 with the law, that's another 2,000 years. And we've had 1/3 with Messiah. So thirds. It's interesting because the Bible that we currently have has approximately 2/3 Old Testament and 1/3 New Testament. Jesus rose on the third day. Jonah was in the fish for 3 days. Ecclesiastes 4:12, a threefold cord is not easily broken. And of course, in Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis, we can see that there was no physical light on earth till after the third day, because Messiah himself was the light for 3 days. So the summary of Revelation chapters 12 to 14 is actually very similar and much the same as what Jesus says in Matthew 24. In Matthew 24, you've got verses 7 to 14, which speak of the tribulation period, okay, the build-up. Then in verses 15 to 21, it's when God's wrath begins, when Satan is cast down and the idol of abomination is set up. And then it speaks of the great tribulation period. That's in verses 22 to 24. And finally, in verses 27 to 28, Jesus speaks about his return to destroy his enemies and cleanse the land. Now, I want you to remember that phrase, cleanse the land. We'll talk about that later. Now, here then, like straight after, in verse 29, Jesus summarizes. So in verse 29 to 30, Jesus summarizes what he just laid out. He said, there is tribulation. And immediately after that tribulation, the Greek word is euthios, and it means like instantly. So euthios, instantly after the tribulation, the sun and the moon will be darkened and the stars will fall, signifying that God he is swift to bring wrath. Can you imagine Pompey's immediate destruction, like that kind of quick wrath and destruction? So in verse 29, immediately after tribulation, then Jesus says, and then. In Greek, it's kai tot, and it means and then, not immediately, okay? So not immediately. It says, then the Son of Man will appear, but not immediately. And then Jesus repeats it. He says, and then he will return. So there's these 2 time periods of where the Son of Man will appear, and then he will return. But neither mean immediately, okay? Yes, there's a tribulation, then immediately the sun and moon are darkened, but then there's a period of time, and the Son of Man will appear. And then there's a period of time where he will return. And then in verse 31, Jesus makes it very clear that he comes with the full force of heaven to attack. Interestingly, in this verse, there is no mention of earth. Now, this is important. This is what it says. It says that he will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. The four winds always signify a heavenly place, from one end of heaven to another. So why doesn't Christ mention a gathering from the earth? Well, because currently the earth's inhabitants are following after the beast at that particular time. This is a heavenly attack. It does make me question whether this verse should ever be used as a rapture event, because there is no mention of any gathering up from the earth. This is a heavenly attack on the enemy. So Revelation 14 begins with the understanding that 1,260 days has now passed since the idol of abomination has been set up. So the beast has had authority for 42 months. That's 1,260 days. We see that in Revelation 13:5. The 6 trumpets have been blown, and the 7th trumpet is coming. That's in Revelation 6. Authority is being claimed over the earth and the sea. Remember, we spoke about the angel with the feet on fire. It's in Revelation 10. So now begins the last 30 days of 1,290 days. And in Daniel, we see that in Daniel 12, verse 11. And this period is called Elul, and it also includes the first day of Yom Teruah. Okay? Now, at this point, the 2 witnesses have been killed and they've been resurrected. We've done that in Revelation 11. And his sign is seen by the world. And remember, we spoke about his sign is the Ark of the Covenant. We have a correlation there between Matthew 24, verse 30 and Revelation 11, verse 19. Because remember, Jesus is the Ark of the Covenant. Ark of the Covenant mean the coffin of the covenant. Remember, his death and resurrection. So heaven is also no longer quiet at now. This is when it starts. Revelation 14 is when it restarts. The half hour is over. Heaven has been quiet for about the second half of the hour of the trial of temptation. That's in Revelation 8, verse 1. And Israel, true Israel, who have been looked after for the past 1,260 days in the wilderness, and also this will include some who are living in Jerusalem who now know that they've been deceived, they will begin to mourn when they see the one that they've pierced. When they see the Ark of the Covenant, it will become very clear. And that is why Elul is called the month of repentance. Okay? And we read that there in Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. So let's begin. Revelation 14, verse 1. It depends which translation you read. It says then or and, but the Greek word there is kai, and it definitely means and, okay? So it says, and I looked, and behold, a lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him was 144,000, having his father's name written on their foreheads. Now the word there really is kai, so it should be and rather than then. Now, it doesn't seem like it's really important, but if you read it as then, you'll think that these things happen chronologically, and that's not the emphasis here. What is the emphasis here is the comparison, okay? So John had just seen a lamb with 2 horns come out of the earth, and is now seeing a lamb coming to reclaim the earth. So this is a comparison of power again. Now, the false lamb that John had just seen is about to encounter the real lamb. You'll notice here that the lamb hasn't entered the temple. He isn't on Mount of Olives. The sign in the sky has simply moved closer and is in position to cleanse the land. This is a battle position, which I'm about to show you, okay? So this particular verse about the Lamb standing on Mount Zion is often mistaken as the moment when Messiah stands on the Mount of Olives. And we see that in Zechariah 14 verse 4, where it says, at that time, he will stand on the Mount of Olives to the east of Jerusalem. And then the Mount of Olives will be split into from east to west by a large valley. In this verse, though, that we're reading now in Revelation, in Revelation 14, we see that the Lamb will stand on Mount Zion first, okay, not on the Mount of Olives yet. This is actually fulfillment of Ezekiel 11, when God is about to cleanse his land. This is a battle position. In Ezekiel 11 verse 6, it says, "You have multiplied your slain in this city and have filled its streets with the slain," which is actually literally what just happened with the witnesses who were laying in the streets. And then in Ezekiel 11 verse 10, it continues, "You shall fall by the sword." This is the interesting part. "I will judge you at the border of Israel." That's in Hebrew, it's Gavul, at the border of Israel. "Then you shall know that I am the Lord." Now, Mount Zion happens to be right now at the border of Israel under a two-state solution. It's called the 1949 Armistice Line. Now, this land border between Israel and whatever it is they're going to choose to do later, through the two-state solution, this land border will most likely continue. And this is potentially related to Joel 3, where it says, "I will also gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there on account of my people, my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations." Then it continues, "They have also divided up my land." Okay? At this point, we should find out, though, more information about Mount Zion, because Mount Zion's changed a little bit. So right here, could the real Mount Zion please stand up? Originally, Mount Zion was the lower eastern hill called the City of David. Now, at first, Mount Zion was given the name, to the Jebusite fortified city, okay? So Mount Zion was the name given to the Jebusite fortified city on the lower part of ancient Jerusalem's eastern hill. Don't get too confused yet. I've got pictures soon, okay? But it was originally, there in the lower part of ancient Jerusalem's eastern hill. Once the first temple was erected at the top of the eastern hill, the name Mount Zion migrated with it. Okay, so it moved from the lower part of ancient Jerusalem's eastern hill. It moved up the hill with the first temple. Okay, and today, the last shift came about, and now it's moved to the western hill. All right, that's where modern day Mount Zion is. It seems in the first century, those who lived in Jerusalem felt that that was a more worthy location, they thought it was a more worthy location for the lost palace of King David. Okay, so it was just a first century decision that they're going to move where Mount Zion is. And that western hill is what today we call Mount Zion. Regardless of all that, whether it be in the City of David or current Mount Zion, it is right there on the border between Israel and the West Bank. So it's right there on the border between Palestinian territory and Israeli territory. Most of that place in the middle there is land that's in dispute, okay, to put it nicely. But when they create, or should they create, but they probably will, excuse me, a two-state solution, that line will be more fortified and will certainly be more direct. But you can see there that Mount Zion is on the border of Jerusalem and the border of Israel. So here we have the Lamb standing on Mount Zion at the border. So when the Lamb and his supporters are there on Mount Zion, that is when we see Ezekiel 39 begin to take place. Excuse me again. Now, we discussed Ezekiel 38 earlier in relation to Revelation chapter 6 and Daniel 11, and possibly Zechariah 5. But now God is drawing Gog once again to bring a final victory over him. And you can imagine having the Lamb and his 144,000 standing on Mount Zion in a battle position that would draw him back. And Ezekiel 39 specifically mentions that this time Gog will be drawn to the mountains of Israel, which is where you had the valley of Jehoshaphat. And it says there in Ezekiel 39, 1-2, "Behold, I am against you, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. And I will turn you around and lead you on, bringing you up from the far north and bring you against the mountains of Israel." Ezekiel 39 is most likely related to Joel 3, because in Joel 3 it says, "I will also gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there on account of my people, my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations. They have also divided up my land." Note here that if you read Joel chapter 2, you will see that Joel chapter 2 is the actual attack against the north. And Joel 2 is the explanation of the lead up. So in English writing, we would have put Joel chapter 3 first, which explains the lead up. And then we would have had Joel chapter 2, which explains what happens after the lead up. But you remember that this is a Hebrew style of writing sometimes, where, and I've mentioned it earlier in Daniel chapter 12, verses 11-12, where because we read it from a very English point of view, we don't realize that the lead up is often first, but it's mentioned second. Okay, so for example, in Daniel 12, 11-12, it says, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,295 days. But the problem is that there is the result. The lead up comes next. "Blessed is he who waits," and comes to the 1,335 days. So the 1,335 days is the lead up to the 1,290 days that remain afterward. And we see that again, as I mentioned, in Joel chapter 2 and Joel chapter 3. Joel chapter 3 is the lead up, and Joel chapter 2 is the result. All right. So Gog's armies and pretty much the whole world now have begun to congregate against the Lamb, Jesus, on Mount Zion. And as we will see later in the bowls of wrath, we'll see how that occurs. The fact, for example, one of them is that the Euphrates River dries up. Okay, so we'll see in later chapters how Gog's armies are able to congregate in the valley of Jehoshaphat. Now, this picture here of the Lamb on Mount Zion getting ready to move in is a reversal of Ezekiel chapters 10-11. If you've studied Ezekiel chapters 10-11, you'll know that this is how the glory of the Lord left the temple. It left incrementally. It departed from the temple first, from the threshold, then from Jerusalem. It moves through the east gate outwards and resides on the hill outside. Okay? This is the beginning of that reversal. So in Ezekiel 10 verse 4, it does say, "Then the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub and paused over the threshold of the temple. And the house," because that's where it started, "the house was filled with the cloud, and the court was full of the brightness of the Lord's glory." Then in Ezekiel 10 verse 18, we see, "Then the glory of the Lord departed from the threshold of the temple." And in verse 19, it continues to say that they stood at the door of the east gate. So it had already begun to move out. Then eventually in Ezekiel chapter 11, verse 23, "The glory of the Lord went up from the city, stood on the mountain, which is on the east side of the city." So the glory of the Lord leaves incrementally. So too will his return. Begins on Mount Zion. Then he moves after a huge battle, moves into Mount of Olives, and then through the east gate back in. All right, so we'll get there when we get there. But it starts at the border. It starts at the border first in fulfillment of the prophecy. So We're still on Revelation chapter 14, verse 1. Okay, so let's talk about the 144,000. They are his servants. We actually understand that from Revelation chapter 22, verse 3. This is a massive show of support. In fact, later on very soon, I'm going to show you something really cool about these guys, okay? So just stay with me. But they show a massive show of support. This is a confirmation to Israel that this lamb is the Messiah and not the other one, okay? So they're like, wow, we've been following the wrong Messiah. These 144,000, interestingly, have been redeemed, which comes later in verse 3. We'll talk about that. These 144,000 have his father's name, which means that they are sealed. We see that in Revelation 7, verse 4, where it says, and I heard the number of those who were sealed. Interestingly, in 2 Corinthians 1, verse 22, Paul speaks about that. He says that we also are sealed. Anyone who is a believer is sealed. Okay. So later in verse 3, I'm going to explain the small difference between the 144,000 and us, because we're all sealed. The Holy Spirit has sealed us all. And God has sealed us all with his Spirit. So Revelation 22 verse 3 does say that his servants shall serve him. They shall see his face and his name shall be on their foreheads. So we know that this 144,000 with the Father's name on their foreheads are his servants. Finally, verse 2 to 3. Okay. And it says, and I heard a voice from heaven like the voice of many waters, and like the voice of loud thunder. And I heard the sound of harpists playing their harps. They sang as it were a new song before the throne, before the four living creatures and the elders. And no one could learn that song except the 144,000 who were redeemed from the earth. All right. The harpists, it says they, and speaking of the harpists, it's quite clear. Some people say that this is 144,000, but that's not what it says here. It says, and I heard the sound of harpists playing their song, and they sang as it were a new song. Okay. So who are these harpists? Well, there is some thought about this that maybe quite likely they are the martyred ones that we see in connection with the fifth seal. They now also include the others which were slain during the Great Tribulation. Okay, so martyred ones would be the answer easily. Now, interestingly, a group of singing harpists, maybe it's the same group, maybe, kind of think so, but interestingly, a group of singing harpists in heaven is mentioned in the very next chapter. Although at that point they're singing a different song. Instead of singing a song that no one could learn, they begin singing the song of Moses and the Lamb. It says there in Revelation chapter 15, 2 to 3, it says, and I saw something like a sea of glass mingled with fire, and those who have the victory over the beast, over his image and over his mark, and over the number of his name. Victory there probably means that they've been martyred. Okay. They've got the number of his name, standing on the sea of glass, having harps of God. They sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb. This here is a song where law and grace are connected. Okay. And we'll get a little bit into that later. But the harp playing here may be related to the fullness of God and new beginnings. If you read 1 Chronicles 15:21, it speaks about those who were directed to play with harps. The Hebrew word there is kanoah. Kanoah is really a stringed instrument. It means twang. Okay, so kanoah means a twanged instrument. So it could be harp, it could be a lyre, it could be electric guitar. I don't know. Okay, but that's what the Hebrew word means there. But these people, Mattatiah, Eliphaz, I can't pronounce all their names, Micaiah, Obed-Edom, Jael, and Azaziah. Okay, well, there you go. They were directed to play harps, and they were directed to play harps, it says in Scripture, on the Sheminith. On the Sheminith. Okay, a lot of discussion about this. What is a Sheminith? And why are harps related to the Sheminith? Well, the Sheminith appears to be derived from the Hebrew word sheman, which usually means the number 8. And the number 8 signifies new beginnings. The word sheman also has to do with dripping fat. It means fullness, saturation. Okay, so it's new beginnings, fullness, and saturations. That is what harps and Sheminith and how they're related, and how it's also related to these harpists right there in heaven in Revelation chapter 14. They are signifying new beginnings, a fullness and a saturation of new beginnings. And if you go through the examples I've got there, Yitzchak, which is Isaac, when Isaac took Rebekah as his wife, the Torah writes that he took her into the tent, and the word ha-ohelah, which means into the tent, is written 8 times in the Torah. So they think that's very important, okay? According to the Clement of Alexandria, the Christ places under the sign of 8 the one who's made to be born again. Okay, so let me explain that better. So according to the Clement of Alexandria, Christ actually himself, he believes that Christ will place the sign of 8, okay, under the one that he has made born again, right? So that the Clement of Alexandria believes that the number 8 and Christ are closely connected. Okay. So, and the 8 also is important because the 8 creative words of God in 6 days. Okay, so God said, well, God created things. There was like 8 creative words in 6 days, and we can see that in Genesis chapter 1. Also, the 8 persons, well, there were 8 people, sorry, that were saved during Noah's flood, and also Jesus was circumcised on the 8th day. It's really, there's a lot of 8s in Scripture. Okay, that's just a few of them that I took from different places. Okay, but many different 8s. So at this point, the harps have begun, new beginnings, saturation. Heaven is no longer quiet. The half hour of quiet is over. All right, remember, heaven is quiet for about the second half of the hour of trial of temptation. Ooh, moving on. So Revelation chapter 14, verse 4a. I've got to split this verse up into 2 parts, okay? So 14a says, these are the ones who were not defiled. All right, they're not defiled with women, for they are virgins. Let's have a look at this word defiled. It is malanyo, okay? Malino, maluno, sorry, my bad, it's ooh, that's right. Maluno, okay? Maluno, it means to soil. Sorry, it means to soil. It's related from the word maano and maluno. They both mean to soil, pollute, and contaminate. Okay, so these 144,000 were not soiled, polluted, or contaminated. It says here with women. There's nothing very politically correct about that. Okay, but let me explain why. It says for their virgins. In Greek, there's at least 2 different words for defile, and we translate them all into English as the word defiled. So yes, you've got maluno, okay, which means to soil, but you've also got konoio, and konoio actually means to make common. That's a different type of unclean. So you've got a soil, pollute kind of unclean, and then you've got to make common unclean. We can see the kind of distinction there in 1 Samuel 21 verse 4, where it says, and the priest answered David and said, there is no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread. Okay, so that common bread doesn't mean it's defiled in a wicked sense, but it's not holy. Okay, and then the priest continued and said, as long as the young men have kept themselves from women, they can have it. I.e., if they had not made themselves common like the bread. Interesting. Because in Scripture, there is actually a commonness about sexual intercourse. No, it's not an uncleaned kind of soiled, okay, that kind of defiled. It is just an unclean common. Now, the difference there is an unclean common means it still falls short of the full glory of God, okay? Remember, sin is falling short of the full glory of God. But some sin is just us being common because we have not reached the full glory of God yet. So there is a difference between making something an unclean common and an unclean soiled. Now, Hebrews 13 verse 4 agrees with this, where the writer of Hebrews says, marriage is honorable among all and the bed undefiled. And you'll see the Greek word there, amiantos, okay? So that there is a derivative of mianano, miaino, oh my goodness, which means unsoiled. So the writer here says marriage is honorable among all and the bed unsoiled. But the writer of Hebrews understood still that it is still common. So even the writer of Hebrews saw the difference between something that makes someone common and something that makes it unsoiled. And the writer of the Hebrews is like, no, it doesn't unsoil it. Don't get confused between the two. All right. And we see this also in Torah. So Leviticus 15 verse 6, it says, if any man has an emission of semen, then he shall wash all his body in water and be unclean until evening. Then it continues in Leviticus 15 verse 18. It's important. It says, also, when a woman lies with a man and there is an emission of semen, they shall bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Now that unclean there does not mean that they're sinful. They are unclean because commonness includes hygiene. Okay, people group that word together, unclean, just to always mean sin, and it doesn't. Oh, rather, it doesn't mean sinful wickedness. Let me clarify that. But uncleanliness is still falling short of the full glory of God, even hygiene. There are some scholars who believe strongly that this purity of the 144,000 is related to them being spiritually clean, okay? And they say, no, this is all about spiritual. This isn't like all physical as well. So they will point out Hebrews 12 verse 3, where it says, for if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean, okay, the unclean, that's what's required to sanctify for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, interestingly, cleanse your conscience. So how much more shall the blood of Christ cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Because there are sacrifices and Torah rituals that are for the cleansing of the flesh. And his eternal sacrifice has always been, remember, Christ was crucified from the foundation of the world. His eternal sacrifice has always been for the cleansing of our hearts and conscience, okay? So these 144,000, getting back to them, these are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These were redeemed from among men, being first fruits to God and to the Lamb. And in their mouth was found no deceit, for they are without fault before the throne of God. All right. First fruits. These guys, there's so many different doctrines and theologies about these, but this is the one that I can see scripturally line up more practically. These guys are the first fruits of Ezekiel 44 verse 45, which is the messianic reign. Okay, these guys are the first fruits of that beautiful millennial reign of Christ. In that millennial reign of Christ, if you read Ezekiel 44 and 45, you will see, just like the Hebrews writer said, you will see the sacrificial system for flesh cleansing work together with faith in Messiah, the heart and conscience cleansing. All right. So they are the first fruits of the millennial reign, somewhat a bit like Noah, who passed through the judgment of the flood into the new order of things. These are the first Jews, if you like, standing with Christ to bring in the new theocracy. Now, but the saints are not far behind, okay? The saints are not far behind at all. But these guys are the first. The combination of a sacrificial system and heart cleansing, a purification, moving into the millennial reign of Christ with Christ. Or as we read in Romans 1 verse 16, to the Jew first and the Gentile. Now it says that in their mouth was found no deceit, for they are without fault. Again, that's because the 144,000 are clean in both. They're clean in flesh. They have been around through the sacrificial system. And so they're clean in flesh and clean in conscience, as will be demonstrated and outworked in the millennial kingdom, as we read there in Ezekiel 44 and 45, and of course in chapters in Isaiah as well and others. Moving on. 6 to 7, verses 6 to 7. Then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea and the springs of water. Now, the everlasting gospel is beautiful. This everlasting gospel is kind of summarized in Isaiah 54 verse 8, where it says, in a little wrath, I hid my face from thee for a moment, but with everlasting kindness, everlasting kindness, I will have mercy on thee, says the Lord thy Redeemer. So, whilst the wrath being poured out onto the world would seem like a long time for us or them, but for the human inhabitants, it's going to seem like a really long time. In an eternal perspective, it is but a mere moment. It's just a little wrath compared to the glory of salvation. Okay, so that's how God sees it. And the emphasis here is that he has an everlasting kindness. That is the everlasting gospel. And then it finishes with the hour of his judgment. Okay, so fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. This is not to be confused with the hour of the trial of temptation, as we've explained in depth at previous chapter sessions. So I'm not going to that because we're running out of time. Finally, verse 8. And another angel followed, saying, Babylon the Great. In some texts it will say the Great, some it doesn't. But Babylon the Great is fallen, that great city, because she has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Now, Babylon the Great is a mystery. I mean, it says that in Revelation chapter 17, verse 5, but there are some theories. So let's go through some of them. All right. The first theory is that Babylon is the actual location of modern Babylon. Now, despite attempts to rebuild Babylon, especially by Saddam Hussein, the place is certainly not a city of wealth or international prestige, okay? In fact, Isaiah and Jeremiah speak of Babylon's destruction, and that would never rise up again. So I'm going to put this forward first. In Jeremiah 54, verse 64, it says, Then you shall say, thus Babylon shall sink and not rise from the catastrophe that I will bring upon her, and they shall be weary. Okay. In Isaiah 13, 19 to 20, it says, And Babylon, the glory of kings, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited, nor will it be settled from generation to generation. Okay. Have a think about that, though, that in Isaiah clearly states that it will be how God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. And the answer to that is it's sudden. Even in Jeremiah 54, verse 64, it says, Thus Babylon shall sink. Okay, that's a sudden catastrophe. All right, so let's just keep that in mind. The resurrection, if you want to call it that, a resurrection of Babylon is only plausible in the respect that the beast may simply and quickly rebuild it. Now, as I just pointed out, the prophecies of Babylon's destruction are about a quick destruction of Babylon, which historically did not happen. In fact, it was a slow abandonment. Every historical textbook says that. It's all true, okay? So some are questioning whether or not Babylon has really been destroyed in the way that the prophets said it would be, okay? Maybe not. Maybe there's more for Babylon. So Babel was the first united front against God of heaven, against the God of heaven, and has had influence over every tribe and tongue because it was the originator of every tribe and tongue. And we read that in Genesis 11, 1-9, okay? Because, basically Babylon was the beginning of harlotry against God. And when you extrapolate that to the fact that that's where every tribe and tongue started, you could honestly say that Babel has influenced every tribe and every tongue. In fact, in Revelation 17, verse 5, it says, "And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots." A good way to say that would be the beginning of harlots. So the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Interestingly, powerful leaders have been active in Babylon throughout history. You've got Nimrod, obviously, who began Babel, but then you've got Nebuchadnezzar, and even in the year 323 BC, Alexander the Great died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. All right, so it's really weird. It's almost like Satan loves that place. The term for the tower of, or the Sumerian term for where the Babel Tower was placed, is called Eta Menanke. Okay, and I've got a picture there. It's on the bottom to the right. It is just a little square box. Eta Menanke. In Sumerian language, it means house of the foundation of heaven on earth. So the house of the foundation of heaven on earth. So there's a lot of belief that that one block of land actually connects the world spiritually, okay? But I won't get into that because it's not scriptural, but that is certainly what a lot of occultists believe by the looks of it, okay? Interestingly, also, Babylon will one day belong to the Lord after being completely destroyed suddenly, but will never rise again as a city, as we see in Isaiah 19:24. In Isaiah 19:24, it says, "In that day, Israel will be one of three with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the land." Yes, that entire region will one day belong to God, and Israel will be the blessing within that land. Sure, Babylon will never rise again, but that area has, I don't know, God's heart is in that area. We'll discuss that maybe in a few minutes. All right. And the other idea about where Babylon is, of course, the United States of America. Interestingly, again, is it prophecy or is it an echo of prophecy? Okay. Interestingly, New York has its own city of Babylon. Okay. So yes, the United Nations has its own city of Babylon. It's just true. Okay. And I've got a little picture there so that you can see it's Babylon, called Babylon, Long Island, New York. Yeah. We all know that the United States of America has had powerful influence over the world. It's certainly a leading center of world commerce. If you can read the notes along with me, I'm just going to skip through them. Many believe it was birthed in Freemasonry. It's certainly noted for its spiritual and moral decay, its dirtiness and impurity. It is also the daughter of another great superpower nation. It's interesting because that's a prophecy in Jeremiah 50, verse 12. Okay, so the daughter of another great superpower came about by England. It's considered to be the world's policeman, and that's actually a fulfillment of a prophecy in Jeremiah 50, where it calls Babylon the hammer of the world. Okay, or that political regime would be the hammer of the world. George Bush Jr., his speech on Inauguration Day on January the 20th, 2005, he said something interesting. He declared in inverted commas, a new order of the ages. And that actually lines up with the American dollar bill, because on the American dollar bill, if you've ever had a good look at it, you've actually got the Eye of Horus. Okay. Now, the Eye of Horus is a widely accepted occultic symbol, especially by the Masons, Freemasons, and others. Okay. The probably the con to all of this about whether or not the United States of America is or isn't is that there is a passage in Revelation 18 verse 4 where there's a call to the Jewish people. Okay, in Revelation 18 verse 4, and it says, "Come out of her, Babylon the Great," is where it's speaking of. "Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues." Now, some people have pointed out that America has a very high Jewish population, which is why it's talking to America. Yeah, but I don't think that that's correct here, because this really is a call for Israel to come out of Babylon spiritually, okay, and stop sharing in the sins. But I can see why they would say, no, this is a call to the American Jewish population to leave America. All right, so the list of similarities is quite alarming, but I would suspect that these are an echo of what will occur in end times to the real demonic superpower, not just to America. A lot of people believe it's the Vatican, that the Vatican is Babylon. They do have worldwide, when I say Vatican, sorry, the Vatican Islam Cooperative. It's called Chrislam. Okay, so whenever I say the Vatican, right now there is a lot of talk about a unification between Islam and Catholicism. So between the two, they've got worldwide influence. When you talk about Catholicism, they talk about, the amount of people, prophets and saints, if you want to put it that way, how many they've killed in its strive for power during the Inquisitions and its takeover. It is currently considering a unification of religion. So yes, a one world religion. So the woman in Revelation 17 verse 4, it says that the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of a fornication. And if you've ever been to a Vatican mass, then you will see a lot of people arrayed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones, holding up golden cups. Okay, so some have pointed to it, the fact that this is proof. All right. Some say that this also is iron and clay, as in the Vatican and Islam, it is a political and a religious movement. Some point out to the fact that the Roman Catholic Church rose to power after the Roman Empire split into 10 kingdoms, and they believe that's a fulfillment of Daniel 7, verse 24. The church does have a single man who's the Pope, acting and speaking for the whole body, which fulfills Daniel chapter 7, verse 8. And it says there, and there in this horn, the kingdom, were eyes like the eyes of a man and a mouth speaking pompous words. So they believe that's the Pope. And also you can say the Catholic Church certainly did change the calendar and the law, fulfilling Daniel 7:25. They said that all the laws are done away with. There's no such thing as Shabbat anymore. It's now Sunday, all these kind of things. And so they've seen all these as fulfillments of an awful lot of prophecy. However, just like the USA list that I just gave you moments ago, yes, the similarities are quite alarming. But both options, be it the USA or the Vatican Islam, Chrislam unite, I think that both options are unlikely because they do not include the significance of Daniel beasts. Okay, Daniel's beasts are really important, especially them being reactivated in end times, as we discussed in previous sessions. Some have also said that it is Israel and Jerusalem itself. When you think about Israel, especially in Jerusalem, but Israel currently has a lot of worldwide influence, especially in medical, you can just Google these, in worldwide influence in medical, technological advancements, military advancements. The Jews have a very strong influence in world banking, Hollywood, political spheres. So there are actually many good reasons to believe that Babylon the harlot is Jerusalem. God calls Israel Babylon multiple times. Like in Isaiah 4 verse 15, it says, though you Israel play the harlot. Okay, so Israel is called Babylon, unfaithful, harlot multiple times. In Revelation 17 verse 6, it says, I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. You know, Jesus said that. Jesus also said that. He said, Jerusalem has killed the prophets in Luke 13, verse 34. It says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. Okay, so again, more connections to Israel and Jerusalem. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet. Okay, so this the prostitute was arrayed in purple. The harlot was arrayed in purple and scarlet, which happened to be the colors of the chief priests and the temple. And you can read that in Exodus 25, 1 through to Exodus 28, verse 43. And of course, in Exodus chapter 25, 38 to 39. So they are the colors of the chief priests in the temple, okay? Thing about this, for those who are like, yeah, it's definitely Jerusalem and Israel. There are also many very good reasons to believe it isn't. For example, Babylon will be destroyed utterly. Remember, Babylon's going to be destroyed utterly and it will never rise again. In Revelation 18, verse 21, it says, and that great city, Babylon, shall be found no more at all. So if it's Babylon, have we just removed Israel and Jerusalem from the planet? Okay. In Zechariah 14, verse 11, it says, speaking of Jerusalem, and men shall dwell in it, and there shall be no more utter destruction, but Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. Okay, so which one is it? Is the city been destroyed and isn't found anymore? Or is it safely inhabited? Okay, so that's why it's very hard at this point to pinpoint it at Jerusalem. Specifically in the book of Revelation, Jerusalem has never been called Babylon. It's called harlot in other passages, as I pointed out, but in the book of Revelation, it's not. It's actually called the great city. In Revelation 11, verse 8, it says, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of our great city. You can see that Jerusalem is not called Babylon or harlot in this verse. So it's called the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. So, after all that, what is possibly the answer? The answer comes more than likely in number 5, which is Greater Israel. Greater Israel is the province which includes Assyria. It includes Babel, yes. So even though right now Babylon is not part of Israel's nationality, the false messiah's evidence, if you want to call it, okay? So the false messiah's built a temple. They're doing signs and wonders. Part of the false messiah's evidence is that he will create greater Israel, okay? So the false messiah's evidence that he is their messiah may be that he is able to unite the province, as we read in Daniel 11. Now, greater Israel, the definitions of where Greater Israel and its borders is found in, I'm not going to read them all out, but it's basically Genesis 15, Deuteronomy 11, Deuteronomy 1, Numbers 34, and Ezekiel 47, okay? And there are borders of where God has promised the land of Israel would be, the borders of all Israel. It's called Greater Israel because it's not just that tiny slab of land that they have right now. God has promised them an enormous amount of land. And interestingly, it covers Babylon, all right? So some scholars believe that Babel is the false Jerusalem. I mean, we've got a false Messiah, we've got a false prophet. Why not have a false Jerusalem as well? And it's highly likely that this false Jerusalem will be very quickly restored as the base of power. It will not undo Jerusalem. It'll be a twin city. So now we have Greater Israel. This false Messiah has proven that he has unified the land just like prophecy has said he would, okay, as the counterfeit of it. But yeah, he will create the temple, create Greater Israel, and within that, he will still have his dirty hands on Babel. Interestingly, when Christ returns, all the land in Greater Israel is cleansed. Okay, so we've got this picture, getting back to the very first verse, where you've got the Mount Zion, Christ stand at Mount Zion, and war's about to occur. It's not long after that that Christ and his followers, it says, they cleanse the land. And people just assume that that's that little strip of Israel that's currently there now. No, the entire land that God has promised to his people will be completely cleansed. And that happens to include Babel. Yeah. So yes, while it wipes out Babylon, and Babel will never ever rise again as a city, part of that destruction also cleansed Jerusalem. And there is a promise that God will bring Jerusalem as his sole city, where people will live safely again. Which it says there again in Zechariah 14 verse 11, and men shall dwell in it, that's Jerusalem, and there shall be no more utter destruction, but Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. Okay, so Babylon is Greater Israel before God cleanses the land. And yes, Babel will be completely destroyed, and the city of Babylon will never rise again. Okay, last part. Is fallen. Ooh, the Greek word there is pipto, Babylon. Now, we've said in previous sessions that if something is repeated 3 times, it means completion. In Ezekiel 21 verse 27, for example, it says, I will overturn it, and it shall be no more until he comes, whose right it is, and I will give it to him. In other words, I will completely and thoroughly overturn it, right? There's a word there that's repeated 3 times. In Numbers chapter 17, verse 12, it says, especially after Aaron's rod had budded, and everyone was freaking out, the children of Israel spoke to Moses, saying, surely we die, we perish. Okay, so it repeats the whole, we perish 3 times, because it meant completion. They felt that they were going to absolutely be wiped out. But twice, if a word's repeated twice, it's different. A word repeated twice often means it will occur quickly. It also, I love this part, it also expresses close intimacy, or it explains any kind of intimacy with a close friend. But yeah, it's close intimacy. So stated in earlier sessions that God gives both wrath and love. Remember, he's both wrath and love at the same time. He is both judgment and mercy at the same time. That's what we're going to see right here. And let me give you some examples, okay? So where a word is repeated twice. So in Genesis 41, verse 32, this is Moses speaking to, this is Joseph speaking to Pharaoh. He says, now as for the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh twice, it means that the matter is determined by God, and God will quickly bring it about, okay? So the fact that Pharaoh had the dream twice meant that it was going to happen quickly. Getting to the intimacy within a close relationship, in Psalm 67, 6-7, you see the word, God shall bless us, like it happens twice. It says, God shall bless us twice, connected, okay? And that happens to be in between those 2 verses. In Psalms 96, verse 13, it says, for he cometh, again, meaning that he's coming quickly. And again, the intimacy, okay, the intimacy of Matthew 23, verse 37. When people read this verse, they see it just as judgment. But Jesus says, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that kills the prophets. So here is Christ judging them, but it also expresses intimacy because he longs to have a close relationship with Jerusalem. So we have seen in the Revelation summary of chapters 12 to 14, the events that bring us to the final battle. Okay, we're not there yet. We've got some more verses to go in Revelation chapter 14. But it is at this point that we will soon see the 144,000 are standing with Christ on Mount Zion, and the 126 days of the beast's authority over the world is now going to be swiftly destroyed. And we see that in Revelation chapter 14, verse 20, which is the end of the summary. Next week, Revelation chapter 14, part 2. We will discuss that final battle that occurs there in verse 20 and the lead up to it in the verses before it, which some call the grapes of wrath, but it talks about the sickle and the winepress.